Welcome everyone to the Latin American Center at Stanford University Friday weekly lecture. My name is Alberto Diaz-Calleros. I'm the director of the center. Since today's lecture will be a Zoom webinar, all attendees are in listen-only mode and only the speakers will be able to share their video. The lecture portion of this webinar is being recorded and live streamed on our class YouTube page. For those of you who may wish to participate in the Q&A, you should be joining into the webinar because the Q&A session will not be live streamed. All webinar attendees are muted throughout the webinar. Please use the Q&A button throughout the webinar and I will read the questions to our presenter at the end of her presentation. And lastly, please note that the post-event recording on our YouTube page will have the captioning option available. However, if you want to enable the automated captioning right now, you can click on the closed caption CC in the meeting controls to view the closed captions. I want to remind us, for those of us who are at Stanford, that we're in the land and the territory of the Ohlone original peoples. I also want to remind us that throughout generations, the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, the Eastern Pequot, the Shakticoke, Golden Hill Pauguesat, Nyantic, and the Quinnipiac, and other Algonquian-speaking peoples have stewarded the lands and the waterways of the Connecticut area where Yale University sits. We want to offer our gratitude to the land, to the water, to the air that surround us, and pay our respects to the past, the present, and the future of the Ohlone, the Lenape, and the Algonquian-speaking peoples who continue to be present in their homelands and throughout their diasporas. I always try to encourage everyone to, at the very least, learn about the impact of the pandemic in Native American populations, indigenous peoples in the Americas, and if you can help in any way to those communities, you should try to. Thank you again. I do want to make a special recognition to Bill Durham, who has invited Professor Elizabeth Wood from Yale University to our seminar today. She will be talking about her really groundbreaking work on civil war in El Salvador, mobilizing from below, forging democracy. I'm a great admirer of her work. I think we have learned so much from her study of a country that some people might not focus so much attention on. We have learned about broad issues of comparative politics throughout many latitudes, not just Central America or Latin America. Professor Libby Wood is the Crosby Professor of the Human Environment and Professor of Political Science, International and Area Studies at Yale University. Her work focuses on political violence, particularly conflict-related sexual violence during civil war, as well as agrarian legacies of war. She's a fellow at the Academy of Arts and Sciences. I will not list a lot of her publications, but she teaches issues of comparative politics, political violence, collective action, agrarian studies, and qualitative field research. Professor Wood, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Alberto, thank you so much for the gracious introduction, and in particular, thank you for that beautiful land acknowledgement. That's really, I so appreciate that. I will now share my screen, and I will be thanking Bill Durham a bit later in my talk, and you'll see why. I will do that later. Okay, someone can confirm that my screen is properly shared. I would appreciate that.
Yes.
Thank you. I'll be talking today, as Alberto mentioned, about the Civil War in El Salvador, and there's going to be two parts to the talk. The idea here is that in a country ruled by the military for decades, that eventually democracy was forged from below through the mobilization of ordinary people, and in particular through campesinos. So this is the puzzle. Despite something like $5 billion in US aid to the regime, the insurgents forced a negotiated revolution to that long civil war. It occurred after a long history of state repression, at times very violent, and it was a particular configuration of the state, and the upper class elite income depended on the state, not on the market. Moreover, that long history gave rise to very high levels of inequality, and therefore also the fear of expropriation should a reform occur. And so experts considered a transition to democracy to be very unlikely through the decades of the rule by the military in El Salvador. Nonetheless, at the end of the Civil War, a negotiated settlement to the war took the form of a democratizing pact. Now, that's unusual. Only about a fifth of civil wars end in successfully implemented agreements. So what we're going to be discussing today is how and why did the war end in a negotiated transition to democracy? That's got two pieces. First of all, the puzzle of high-risk collective action in El Salvador. So my argument is that the insurgency that drove the civil war, that led to finally elite compromise and a negotiated transition, took place by campesinos, by peasants, in a context of exceedingly high risk. How is that possible? And second, how did that mobilization from below lead to elite willingness to compromise finally after decades and decades? What do I mean by high-risk collective action? This is a graph, best data that we have of war-related deaths in El Salvador. These are civilian deaths over the course of the war. And I should add that before this graph begins, there were also very high levels of civilian deaths. So in a country of, at the time, about 5 million people, the beginning of the war, we were seeing documented about 15 to 20,000 civilian deaths a year. It only fell beginning in about 1983. There's a story behind that, which I will get to. So in this context of high repression, civilians ran very high risk in supporting the insurgency. Something like 75,000 civilians were killed over the course of the war. That was recently confirmed by a very high-tech statistical estimate. It's also the figure the Truth Commission gave in the immediate aftermath of the war. That's about 2% of the entire population. That's on a scale of the US Civil War. The Truth Commission found that roughly 85% of those civilian deaths were at the hands of state forces. So very high risk to support the insurgents. As you can see, most of the deaths were early on, and then again in 1989, when the insurgents launched a so-called final offensive. Now, in these early years of the war, 1980-81, that was a time of several large massacres, one of which is when the soldiers of the US-trained Atla Battalion descended on the village of El Mozote and several nearby villages and executed nearly 1,000 civilians, half of them children, and they also engaged in rape. Now, justice may finally be done for that massacre thanks to the extraordinary efforts of Stanford's Professor Terry Karp, who has been tireless in gathering evidence and testifying to a series of trials, getting justice for. I'm sorry, I'm missing a slide. I'll get to it in a minute. She's just been absolutely essential in serving as again and again and again as an expert witness in trials, bringing state leaders and in particular military leaders to accountability for the violence against civilians during the war. Now, the pattern of collective action did evolve over the course of the war, but throughout the war, even after that decline in civilian killings, it remained very dangerous to support the insurgency. You were targeted if you were doing so. Now, my argument, you'll see, is that civilian support of the insurgents was absolutely key. Yes, some people joined, became full-time combatants, but it was civilian intelligence that made possible the insurgents fighting the US-backed government to a standstill, therefore forcing a negotiated resolution to the war. So why would you participate in such high-risk circumstances? Well, let me just very briefly say something about the origins of the war before turning that to that first of our two questions. El Salvador's history is one of economic, social, and political exclusion. More specifically, it has a long history of labor, repressive export, agriculture, rooted initially in the export of indigo and later in a coffee boom beginning in the late 19th century that led to a takeover of indigenous lands, followed by debt peonage and a rebellion in the early 1930s, led to a massacre at that time of something like 17 to 20,000 people, and followed by the rule by the military with a kind of veneer of elections with a few brief exceptions. There were sometimes currents within the military that attempted to reform this very exclusive form of rule, but there were immediate coup attempts against those reform efforts. So the result was a rigidly classist society marked by very high levels of inequality. So this is the distribution of farmland in 1971, the data that we have from before the war. And you can see that these tiny farms, these farms are just less than a hectare, where almost 50% of farms, so 50% of the farms held only 5% of land, whereas up here, large farms comprise less than 1% of farms and yet comprise almost 40% of farmland. And you can be sure that is also the best farmland. Here's a picture of Terry Carl, whose efforts to bring the military to justice have just been remarkable and so inspiring. I want to also say she was my dissertation advisor at Stanford and also the advisor of my master's thesis on Tenancingo, and also serving on my committee was Bill Durham. So Bill, thank you once again for sharing your notes, your memories, and getting me started on a master's thesis, which then became the first part of my research on El Salvador. Okay, so what I wanted to study was the forms of mobilization in the context of political repression and exclusion. And in particular, my initial interest was in Tenancingo itself, and I'll come back to that. But it's extremely difficult to investigate political mobilization during civil war. Now, in that pattern of extreme economic exclusion had arisen some reformist efforts by the Christian Democratic Party, but more importantly, a new theology on the part of the Catholic Church, liberation theology. I'd be happy to say more about that in the Q&A. What we need to know for our purposes is that liberation theology in the countryside and in the urban peripheral areas led to a very widespread nonviolent social movement in the 1970s. Liberation theology had its roots in Vatican II and its the Catholic Church's renewed engagement with real-world issues, particularly in Latin America, and the concern with ongoing poverty and exclusion. So liberation theology takes as its center that God is a God of history, of real-world suffering, of conditions of life, and not just the afterlife. So he seeks, the idea in liberation theology is that God seeks justice in this world, not just in the afterlife. In El Salvador in particular, the Jesuits embraced liberation theology and were very active in teaching it in high schools and universities. There were Jesuit priests out in local dioceses throughout the countryside and so on. So this meant that across the countryside, people were being formed intellectually into a new set of theological beliefs through Bible study groups, through being trained as lay catechists, and all of this led to participation in this massive nonviolent social movement. Now, the state's response to that, to these demands for land, better wages, more jobs, the response of the state was one of indiscriminate violence and repression. Leading up to the Civil War, and then you saw that wave of violence at the beginning of the Civil War. And as a consequence of that state repression, many of the activists in the nonviolent social movements, some fled, to the cities, to the United States. Others demobilized, and some either joined the insurgent armed groups, which by 1979 were still very small, or they became civilian supporters of those civilian groups, which in 1980 became the FMLN, the Frente Farabundo Martí para Liberación Nacional. So that nonviolent social mobilization under the fist of state repression led to this civil war, which then gave rise to this wave of US aid and US training to the Salvadoran government. Nonetheless, the insurgents persisted. It was a military stalemate by about 1984, despite that aid and training, and the war ended in a peace agreement in 1992. So my work tries to trace those processes, but how do you do that during a civil war? It's very tough for reasons that are probably pretty obvious. Key data is missing or inconsistently recorded. We have some records of deaths. As I said, there's been some recent statistical work on this. There's urban bias in the data that we do have. Many of the sources are biased in one direction or another, and it's not always so easy to tell in which direction they are biased. And of course, the research conditions at the time were very difficult in 1986. When I was working on Tenancingo in particular, though it was supposed to be una isla de paz, nonetheless, there were still military conflicts in the immediate area, and I would often pass through several checkpoints on my way there. So nonetheless, it was possible with the support of these great scholars, both at Berkeley and at Stanford, to carry out field research, first for my MA thesis, then for my doctoral dissertation. So 26 months in 5 areas over from 1987 to 1996, and in particular, a very concentrated period of field research, 15 months of field research from 1991 to 1992 at the close of the war. So just to orient us a little bit, the capital city is here. Tenancingo, the place that I first studied, is here in the department of Cuscatlan. My doctoral dissertation research focused on this department, the department of Usulután, as a kind of microcosm of the entire country. So this is Tenancingo, an area of scattered small farms, a few larger farms, an area of microcosm of inequality in El Salvador, which had been bombed twice over the course of the Civil War. And then in 1986 was the site of a very unusual project, an agreement forged by the church between the FMLN and the Salvadoran military that it would be repopulated as that island of peace. These are the 4 case study areas in my later work for my dissertation in Usulután. And what's important here is that this case study area is on the coast, where there was the site of very large haciendas dedicated to cotton and some cattle. This area up here is the coffee highlands, very wealthy properties, though smaller. And then in between is this area of small holding on very jagged kind of foothill lands, not suitable for hot coffee, poor soil, and a lot of smaller, some medium-sized farms there. So that was, those were my sites. And what did I do? Lots of oral histories with residents of these contested areas during the war. More formal semi-structured interviews with landlords. I had to track them down because they were no longer living in these contested areas, with military commanders, Salvadoran military commanders, with FMLN military commanders, particularly during the ceasefire, and then with UN, various NGO, USAID staff members, all of whom were very helpful. I also drew on databases of land transfers, both the agrarian reform and later the wave of land occupations towards the end of the war that I'll talk about, post-war surveys, and various kinds of documents. And I also, with people in Usulutan, I gathered information about the difference that the war had made through workshops to draw maps. So this is the kind of setting. This is the floor of an abandoned schoolhouse. And I asked teams of people from different kinds of cooperatives that had emerged in the Sultan, some of which were founded by a counterinsurgency agrarian reform funded by the US government, others that emerged by from below on the part of insurgent supporters. So the idea was I asked them to draw a map of their area, what it looked like before the war, and to draw a map of what it looked like after the war. And I'll be talking about these maps a little bit later. So, but first I need to do some kind of theoretical ground clearing. If I want to understand why ordinary people, particularly those in the countryside, were willing to run these very high risks to support the insurgents, I need to first assess conventional explanations. Political opportunity. Political opportunity opens, people with ongoing grievances mobilize. Not the case in the midst of a civil war, and not the case in the midst of that earlier wave of repression. Political opportunity does not explain the mobilization, either the nonviolent mobilization or the mobilization in support of the FMLN, though it does support a particular kind of mobilization at the very end of the war. Another idea in the literature, well, high-risk collective action is supported by strong communities or strong social networks. Well, that's not easily the case in the Salvadoran countryside. This is a map from a remarkable book by a Jesuit named Carlos Rafael Cabarrús, who was working in a municipality just north of Tenancingo. And this is a map in the late 1970s, early 1980s, of the very deeply divided political loyalties in this area of El Salvador. So FECAS is a Christian federation of campesinos, supporters, broadly speaking, of the movement for land and social justice. Orden is a right-wing paramilitary, lots of military veterans supporting the government. And you can see that these were scattered throughout this is a village. Throughout this village, political loyalties were extremely divided. So you don't have those strong, homogeneous communities. Well, okay, so we're mobilizing, you've been talking about peasants, poor people, maybe we're mobilizing by class. Well, again, not such a tidy story. Middle campesinos, this is again data from Cabarrús in this area just north of Tenancingo. Middle campesinos, who did they support? Well, there was some support for FECAS, some support for the opposition, but a lot of support for Orden, that right-wing militia organization. Proletarian campesinos, campesinos without land, okay, more support for this opposition supporter, and that's the total of all opposition, including Christian Democrats formation. And again, there's still a lot of support for the right among proletarian campesinos. And the same is true for day laborers. So there's not an easy mapping between class position and support for these organizations that are part of this broad social field in support of the insurgency. So pre-war class affiliations do not predict participation, and differently situated rural people acted similarly, and similarly situated people acted differently. I also observed that in my case study areas. So class mobilization does not provide a nice explanation. Another kind of literature here emphasizes the work of political entrepreneurs. So people respond, the idea is to political entrepreneurs offering selective benefits contingent on participation. You'll have a better livelihood if you support this movement. You'll be protected if you support this movement. You'll get land if you support this movement. Well, what about protection and selective benefits? This is not a picture of the FMLN. This is a picture of the FARC in Colombia. Very well-funded insurgent organization. This is a picture of the FMLN. Notice any differences? You have a very well-funded, very professional army of an insurgency here, drinking Coke, eating store-bought bread. Here you have campesinos handing over stacks of tortilla to exceedingly strong, scrawny guerrilleros. So it was not the case that you had a nice livelihood if you turned to supporting the FMLN. Here's another indication. On the left, you have a hamlet high in the coffee highlands. These are fairly small coffee holdings, and the members of the insurgent allied cooperative that emerged in this town drew these maps for me. You can see here a list of the landlords with numbers corresponding to their properties. Very detailed map that they have in their minds. And on the right, they mapped what that looked like after the war. And so you have now propiedades de la cooperativa. So that they're indicating which of these properties in pink are now lands that they are claiming as occupied by their cooperative now towards the end of the war. So they've named them various things. They've also commemorated 2 sites where 2 FMLN local commanders were killed. And one interesting thing about this map is they did not occupy every property. They were quite selective. They occupied the properties of landlords who they thought before the war had been particularly harsh, cruel, unjust. It's important to note that any of the campesinos living in this area could farm somewhere. All of this land had been abandoned by their landowners, so you could farm. Land was there, but nonetheless, some chose, about a third, chose to organize formally as these insurgent cooperatives and say, we are claiming this land. Okay, so access to land through political entrepreneurs does not explain mobilization either. There was access to land. What about coercion? Well, this is an interesting case. This is a cooperative of a different kind, one of the large agrarian reform cooperatives along the coast. And what you see here is, again, what it looked like, this large hacienda, La Hacienda California, what it looked like before the war. All these lollipop things, that's cotton. That's the representation of cotton, the members of this cooperative. There's an airstrip, and there up here, there's both an airstrip because cotton in the tropics is an extremely pesticide-intensive crop. So you had to have an airplane flying around, dropping pesticides. There's also a barracks of the National Guard. That's a kind of symbol of this close coordination between the economic elite and the security forces before the war. Down here along the coast, these are the mangroves. And these cockroach-looking things are cows. That's how they drew cows. And the guy who drew the cows got a lot of crap from his fellow cooperative members for having them look like cucarachas. Okay, this is what it looks like after the war. So this property was occupied by the military early on in the war because the US said, if you want our support, you have to engage in counterinsurgency to undermine peasant support for these insurgents. You need to distribute land. So they occupied this hacienda and they turned it over to the permanent workers. The permanent workers now held this land. They farmed it individually. You now see the cows assigned to individual households. They had individual plots. The state, after a few years, no longer provided inputs and credit to support cotton. So they started growing, guess what? Corn. And the remarkable thing here is that though they were beneficiaries of this counterinsurgency agrarian reform, they still supported the FMLN. So the offer of land by the state and the threat of coercion by the state was not enough that they did not support the FMLN. So the FMLN could come through this property and camp on the property without with the permission of the cooperative, with nobody saying anything. So let's state this puzzle of high-risk mobilization more precisely, given that 2/3 of the residents of these case study areas chose not to support the insurgency. And so it was possible not to support the insurgency. So neither was it coercion on the part of the FMLN. What explains the insurgent collective action of the other third? So you could be there, you weren't forced to support the FMLN, except for occasionally giving tortillas. You also had to give tortillas and water to the army, but you could be there without supporting these insurgent cooperatives. So why did a third do that? Again, why did people so similar in their economic circumstances before the war act so differently? And why did people in different circumstances sometimes act so similarly? That's what I talked to members of these cooperatives at great length, doing oral histories, both of their communities and also of the emergence of the cooperative themselves. And these were the themes, time and again, long narratives about just how unjust social relations were before the war. Immiserating wages paid with no increase decade on decade, horrendous labor conditions and expectations, decade in, decade out. In the 1970s, mounting moral outrage at state violence, at its indiscriminate nature, that there may have been a few activists from a town mobilizing in these marches and so on, but the military would go in and carry out these very repressive operations. And I mentioned El Mozote, though that was in another area of the country. There were also smaller massacres in this area. So moral outrage was really important here. And then later, as these insurgent cooperatives emerged, and a bit earlier as people began supporting the FMLN, they talked about their pleasure, what I call the pleasure of collective agency, how important it was after decades of exclusion and repression to be making history in the sense of redrawing boundaries, defying these unjust authorities, and so on. So here's an example. This is a before map from that kind of just between the foothills and the coffee lands. So you have to imagine you're standing on a hill, you're looking down at a village, and then you're looking up at a perfectly conically shaped hill. Can you see it? There's a conically shaped hill. And then what this incredible cartographer has done is he's looking at the hill and remembering it, and then he remembers what it looks like back behind, and he opens it up like that. What an incredible cartographic projection this is. So he then drew the properties and the crops. And this property was planted, this conically shaped hill, planted entirely in coffee. There were colonels, a colonel who owned a lot of it, and he drew some of the boundaries of the property. And then look what he wrote on this, totally unsolicited by me. I did not ask them to write anything. He wrote, Cooperativa El Jovalito de Caserio Lo Mapache, hecho por Ricardo Hernández. I absolutely did not want them to put their names on these maps. This was dangerous. But he insisted on putting his name. And also you can see he wrote here, Hacia el Cerro de Taburete, propiedades tomadas por personas campesinas. This is how it was, the Taburete Hill, properties taken over by campesino peoples, by peasant peoples. That is a prideful slogan. And if you know Spanish, you can see that this is a person who is not very literate, who nonetheless insisted on writing that prideful slogan on the map. Okay, in the interviews, the oral histories, the various encounters with supporters of the insurgency, there was lots of evidence of this new prideful insurgent political culture. What a contrast with the forcefully submissive peasant culture that had been documented by scholars before the mobilization. And we have some survey evidence of this. A survey soon after the end of the war, people in the countryside were asked, do you trust the army? You could respond, almost never trust the army, almost never trust the institutions of the government. Courts never grant fair trials, and so on. So you could choose these things. And what you see is that this distrust, in particular of the army and the institutions of the government, is on the part of what are called insurgents here, that is, people who supported the emergence of these insurgent cooperatives. So this is evidence from a survey of the emergence of a new insurgent political culture. So just to recognize some of the challenges of the caveats behind this work, it's hard to interpret data from conflict zones because of potential for bias. It's also, a lot of these interviews were carried out after the beginning of the ceasefire. So there was a kind of euphoria in the countryside. Was that somehow shaping people's responses to my questions? So in one chapter of my book, I assess those caveats and nonetheless come to the conclusion that we have to take, in this case, people's own reasons for participation very seriously. That is, I interpret them as reason for acting at the time. I ask in the book, if what else could have given rise to this particular insurgent culture that I documented at the close of the war, were it not for exactly the process that they were describing in their interviews. So I take it very seriously, what people themselves were telling me. So just some definitions. Here I treat reasons for acting, values, norms, commitments, emotions, yes, material interests and aversions. Any of those things could be a reason for acting. A belief is your understanding of what is possible and the probable consequences given your interactions with other actors, the military, the FMLN, your neighbors, and so on. And path-dependent outcomes are persistent outcomes that might have been different if initial events had been minimally different earlier on. So those are the building blocks. So now let me just state the argument overall. Conventional explanations are inadequate. I hope I showed you that. Initially, liberation theology changed the beliefs about what is possible, and I should add, gave people hope for a different kind of world. And then drawing on this ethnographic material, I make a case for moral and emotional reasons for acting in support of the insurgency despite those very high risks. So the idea here is that participation itself in this movement became a value. It was an in-process kind of benefit to participation. It was a value that, if you like, made you think highly of yourself, that you are a prideful and a person of dignity. Defiance, defying this unjust authority that killed your family, your kin, your people in your community. That's another regarding kind of reason for acting. And then this idea of pleasure and collective agency. Acting together, we are reforging history. We are redrawing boundaries. So now where, when, and how that new political culture that sustained this mobilization emerged depends on the path of state violence and proximity to state forces. So this didn't happen everywhere across El Salvador. These are path-dependent outcomes that are very dependent on the particular history in that region over the course of the war. And then this recursive process of participation and success. So we occupy one property, we hold on to it, we don't get kicked off. We occupy another one, yay, we again didn't get kicked off, and so on. That's the kind of process that I document in the book, giving rise to this culture. So stating it more abstractly, where economic and social exclusion is accompanied by denigration and contempt. So note, it's not just economic exclusion, it's that social contempt in which you're held. Pleasure in agency may be a powerful reason for participating in collective action despite those high risks. So at the close of the book, I discuss a couple of other cases where I think this is true: the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, the anti-apartheid movement, and there's also lots of evidence more recently from behavioral economics on what are called social preferences. I can talk about that in the Q&A if you like. Okay, maybe that fueled the sustained mobilization, the kind of defiance you see in the top photograph taken by this extraordinary war photographer who is a friend of mine. But how did that lead to this incredible celebration in January 1992 after the signing of a peace agreement between the government and the FMLN? Well, just very quickly, that sustained mobilization forged the FMLN as one of the Latin America's strongest guerrilla groups. And the state's response, as I said, was violence, initially indiscriminate, more selective later, but also counterinsurgency to try to undercut the support of the countryside for the FMLN. Too late for that third that was actively supporting the FMLN. On the part of the economic elite, there was a twin response. One was to found death squads. In one of the towns that I showed you, there was a death squad that killed tons of activists right there in the town. They also founded this rightist political party, Arena, that governed the country immediately after the peace agreement. There was a military stalemate between the FMLN and the government by 1984, despite substantial US aid. And I make a case in the book that that was all about intelligence, high quality intelligence that is very difficult to coerce. Now, the economic effects of this insurgency was of this extreme decline in GDP of more than a quarter over the initial years of the war. And there was a twofold threat to landlord interests. One was that agrarian reform, but also the agrarian reform and the war itself and the occupation of property changed the terms of production. And of course, personal security on the part of landlords, they basically exited these areas. So in terms of the structure of the country, this is what happened. Export agriculture, it boomed actually just before the war. That's the diamonds. And then it fell it fell dramatically through the years of the war. So export agriculture goes through the floor. Manufacturing just kind of ticks along as a share of GDP. Commerce grows quite strongly. And that boom in commerce is very important, but I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. You might say, well, maybe this is something happening throughout Latin America. There was some decline in the area of coffee production in Guatemala, but that was certainly not the case in Costa Rica or Honduras. It fell in production in El Salvador. So this is the war hitting El Salvador in particular. This is a war-driven effect. So these are the inflows of foreign exchange to El Salvador. And what you see here is that's the export income from export. This is the authorized US aid, the triangles. So yes, that booms in the early years of the war. It's pretty steady over the course of the war and then begins to fall. Look at this. This is remittances. So that wave of repression forced something like 20% of the Salvadoran population away from their homes, many of whom ended up in the US, and they send back an incredible amount of money to their families, which then fuels various kinds of commercial markets in San Salvador and in the other cities, and also families can then buy land. So what happened then in terms of getting to compromise is that this meant that economic elites now had interests that were no longer based on export agriculture, contrary to the long century before that. The 1989 offensive by the FMLN right into the capital city persuaded elites that the war would not disappear with the end of the Cold War, right? End of Cold War, the FMLN, supposedly a communist insurgency, was going to wither away, no problem. Clearly not the case. But it's also clear that they did not take the city. It was also clear that the insurgents would not win militarily. So a transition to socialism, part of their original idea, was very unlikely. This meant that there was a kind of possibility of negotiations, which led to the 1992 peace agreement. I'm running out of time, so I can talk about this more in the Q&A, but key parts of that were military reforms, including finally a civilian police force. The FMLN finally was allowed to become a political party so that the left could contest elections. Private property was enshrined as a principle in the Constitution, to be sure, but there was an agreement to distribute some of that occupied land that was occupied at the end of the war. There was also set up some transitional justice institution. I mentioned the Truth Commission already. There was also a general amnesty of the Salvadoran military, but there was an ad hoc commission. Now, that general amnesty was later rolled back by a series of court judgments, culminating this week in a hearing in San Salvador about the El Mozote massacre that I mentioned, where Professor Terry Carl provided key testimony over 3 days. I can't tell you how proud I am to be one of her students. That persistence, that determination, that poise to provide that testimony in that setting. Okay, so this is a graph of the overall argument. This sustained insurgent movement led to a stalemate, also threatened, and in the Salvadoran case, changed elite economic interests. That stalemate meant that you had to negotiate with the FMLN. Nothing was going to happen if you didn't negotiate with the FMLN. That's what I mean by an insurgent elite. That threat to the economic interests led to a change in the balance of power within the regime. That is, it became possible within the regime to move towards a negotiated transition to democracy. That is, procedural democracy became acceptable to both the elites and the counter-elites. This is just a map of land transfers to those insurgent cooperatives at the end of the war. So between the agrarian reform and that transfer of land at the end of the war, something like a quarter of farmland in El Salvador was transferred. I don't have time to go through that. So just to finish, the agrarian legacies of the Civil War were various. So one was that massive displacement to cities and to the US. A second is, much more positive, the democratization of land tenure and social relations in some parts of the countryside. Not only that hitherto landless and people with very little or very bad land got land, but they also came to this sense of themselves as fully citizens, not merely subjects. The transformation of elite economic interests also, I argue, led to the democratization of the regime. It's a long story what happened after the end of the war in El Salvador, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A a bit, although I have to say it's not something I work on. But I do want to say that there remain these democratized legacies in the Salvadoran countryside. Remember that one huge hacienda with the cockroach-looking cows? That is part of this civil association of civic associations that manage quite a stretch of property now continuing along that coast. Mobilization from below forged democracy in El Salvador, I argue. Key was that mobilization's transformation from nonviolent to violent mobilization because of extreme state repression. That peasant insurgency was sustained by moral and emotional commitments to forging social justice, which eventually took the form, the limited form, I have to say, of procedural democracy via the insurgency's threat to economic interests. So these are the sources on which I drew, and I look forward to Q&A. Thanks so much for listening.